It's just before 10 at night on September 30th, 2025, and the island of Cebu, one of the most densely populated regions in the entire Philippines, is settling into an ordinary Tuesday evening. Then, for 30 seconds, the ground simply stops being solid. In the town of Bogo, at the northern tip of the island, buildings that have stood for generations begin to crack, then crumble. Within moments, cell networks across central Visayas are flooded with a single urgent question, repeated in different words by millions of people at once. What just happened, and why didn't we know this fault existed? By the time seismologists finish their fieldwork days later, the answer is more unsettling than anyone expected. This wasn't a rupture of any fault already sitting on the Philippines' official hazard maps. Government scientists walking the cracked, upheaved ground of Bogo discover something they'd feared but had never been able to confirm. A section of the country's enormous 200-kilometer Philippine fault system that nobody had previously identified as an independent, active structure, capable of producing exactly the kind of damaging, shallow earthquake that had just leveled parts of an entire town. They would go on to give it a name, the Bogo Bay Fault. And its sudden, violent introduction to the scientific record is a story about exactly what happens when a decades-old prediction that this fault system holds more hidden danger than anyone had fully mapped, finally, catastrophically, proves itself true. I am your name, and this is your channel. If you want the real science behind breaking geological events like this one, subscribe now, because we go this deep into stories exactly like this every single week. Let's start with the fault system this new discovery belongs to, because understanding its scale is the key to understanding why scientists have spent decades bracing for exactly this kind of surprise. The Philippine fault system is one of the longest, most active strike-slip fault systems on the planet, stretching roughly 200 kilometers from the southeastern tip of Mindanao all the way to the northwestern coast of Luzon. It's what geologists call a left lateral strike-slip fault, meaning the ground on either side of it slides horizontally past itself, rather than one side thrusting up and over the other the way it does along a subduction zone. This immense fault exists because of where the Philippines physically sits on the map of Earth's tectonic plates. The islands are caught in an almost impossibly complicated squeeze zone, wedged between the Philippine Sea Plate to the east and the Sunda Plate to the west, both plates converging on the archipelago at an angle rather than head-on. That oblique collision doesn't resolve itself as a single, clean motion. Instead, the stress splits, part of it absorbed by subduction along deep offshore trenches like the Philippine Trench and the Manila Trench, and part of it absorbed by horizontal strike-slip motion along the Philippine fault system itself, which essentially acts as a release valve, running straight through the middle of the country's most populated islands. Because this fault system is so long and cuts through such varied terrain, from mountainous Mindanao to the flat river valleys around Manila to the scattered islands of the Visayas, scientists have never treated it as one single uniform structure. It's understood to be highly segmented, broken into dozens of individual fault sections, each capable of rupturing somewhat independently, and each carrying its own specific history, slip rate, and earthquake potential. That segmentation is exactly why a single, sprawling fault system this size has been responsible for some of the most devastating earthquakes in Philippine history, including a magnitude 8.0 earthquake and tsunami along the related Cotabato Trench in 1976 that killed 8,000 people, a scale of disaster seared into the country's collective memory of what this broader tectonic system is capable of producing. Here's the specific warning that hung over Philippine seismology for years before the Cebu earthquake, and it's the exact prediction this event ended up confirming in the most direct way possible. Because the Philippine fault system is so extensive, and because comprehensive, high-resolution mapping of every single segment across the entire archipelago requires enormous, sustained scientific investment, Philippine seismologists have repeatedly and publicly acknowledged a specific, uncomfortable gap in their own knowledge. There are almost certainly active fault segments within this broader system that have not yet been formally identified, mapped, or assessed for hazard, simply because they haven't produced a large enough earthquake in the modern instrumental record to reveal themselves. This isn't a fringe concern. It's a standard, acknowledged limitation voiced repeatedly by the Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology, known as PHIVOLCS, the government agency responsible for the country's earthquake and volcano monitoring. In fact, in June 2026, just months after the Cebu earthquake, PHIVOLCS Director Teresito Bacolcol made this exact concern explicit and public, telling the Philippine news agency that all areas located along the country's 6 major active trenches could experience an earthquake of up to magnitude 8.2. That statement reflects the agency's ongoing active effort to reassess and communicate the country's full seismic hazard picture, precisely because events like the one in Cebu keep demonstrating that the known mapped hazard is not the complete picture. The Cebu earthquake is what happens when that acknowledged theoretical gap in scientific knowledge stops being theoretical. On September 30th, 2025, A magnitude 6.9 earthquake struck central Visayas at a shallow depth of just 5 to 10 kilometers. An extraordinarily shallow rupture that transferred an enormous share of its energy directly into damaging ground shaking rather than dissipating harmlessly through miles of overlying rock. The earthquake killed at least 79 people, injured 271 others, and caused an estimated 16.23 billion Philippine pesos, roughly 330 million US dollars, in damage, destroying or damaging approximately 185,900 homes across the region. When PHIVOLC's field teams arrived in Bogo in the earthquake's immediate aftermath, they weren't simply assessing damage. They were hunting for the specific physical evidence that would tell them exactly what had ruptured beneath the town. Because the earthquake's shallow depth and its location, well away from any previously mapped major fault trace, immediately raised the question of whether this was a known structure behaving unexpectedly, or something the country's hazard maps had simply never captured at all. What they found settled the question directly. Scientists documented clear surface ruptures and fresh fault scarps, physical, visible tears, and vertical offsets in the ground itself, cutting through the landscape around Bogo. A surface rupture is about as unambiguous a piece of evidence as earthquake science produces. It's not a model, not an inference from seismic waveforms recorded miles away. It's the fault itself, physically exposed at the surface, showing scientists exactly where the rock actually broke. Based on this direct field evidence, PHIVOLC's formally confirmed that the earthquake had occurred along a previously unnamed structure, which they subsequently designated the Bogo Bay Fault, identifying it as a genuine independent segment connected to the broader Philippine fault system's architecture running through the Visayas. In the days and weeks that followed, the region experienced more than 12,079 recorded aftershocks of magnitude 1.0 or greater, including a magnitude 5.8 aftershock on October 13, 2025, a sustained, extended sequence that gave scientists an unusually rich, ongoing dataset for understanding this newly identified fault's behavior in real time, rather than having to reconstruct it purely from the historical record, the way researchers often must for faults that haven't ruptured in living memory. It's worth pausing here to explain exactly why the discovery of a previously unidentified fault, rather than simply the size of the earthquake itself, is the part of this story that should concern you most, because it points to a structural limitation in how earthquake hazard gets assessed everywhere, not just in the Philippines. Modern seismic hazard maps, the tools engineers use to set building codes, and the tools governments use to plan emergency response, are built primarily around faults that scientists have already identified and characterized. Faults with known locations, known slip rates, and at least some paleoseismic history reconstructed from trenching studies or historical records. A fault that hasn't ruptured large enough to leave clear evidence within the window of time scientists have been able to study essentially doesn't exist on those maps, not because scientists have concluded it's safe, but because there's been no direct evidence yet to confirm it's dangerous. This creates an inherent uncomfortable asymmetry in earthquake hazard science. A known, well-studied fault, even one considered dangerous, at least allows for targeted building codes, focused public awareness campaigns, and prioritized retrofitting in the specific communities sitting directly above it. An unknown fault offers none of that. The first time it reveals itself to science is very often the first time it produces a damaging earthquake, which means the community sitting on top of it has had no opportunity to prepare specifically for that risk, because nobody, including the government agencies responsible for public safety, knew the risk existed in that specific form. This is precisely the scenario Bogo experienced. A town that had no reason to believe it sat above an independently dangerous fault segment discovered that fact only in the exact moment the fault ruptured beneath it. And because the Philippine fault system is so extensive, running the length of the entire archipelago through some of the country's most densely populated regions, the Bogo Bay Fault's sudden appearance in the scientific record is treated by seismologists less as an isolated anomaly and more as direct physical confirmation that similar undiscovered segments likely exist elsewhere along this same sprawling system, simply waiting for their own turn to rupture and reveal themselves. This concern isn't confined to the Visayas. It connects directly to the single most consequential piece of fault science currently being studied anywhere in the Philippines, the Marikina Valley Fault System, more commonly known as the West Valley Fault, which runs directly beneath the eastern edge of Metro Manila, the most densely populated urban region in the entire country. PHIVOLC's own scenario modeling identifies a full rupture of the West Valley Fault as capable of producing a magnitude 7.2 earthquake, an event the agency estimates could cause more than 37,000 fatalities and 605,000 injuries across greater Metro Manila, driven primarily by widespread structural collapse in a region built up over decades, without the benefit of knowing the full extent of the danger sitting directly beneath it. Paleoseismic research on this fault system, using radiocarbon dating techniques to reconstruct its rupture history from trenched soil layers, has already concluded that this fault poses a considerably greater seismic hazard than scientists had previously understood, and that its historical earthquake recurrence interval measures in the hundreds of years, not the thousands of years earlier, less detailed assessments had assumed. The through line connecting the West Valley Fault research to the Bogo Bay Fault discovery is exactly the pattern the Cebu earthquake confirmed in the most direct way science allows. Every time researchers apply more detailed, more rigorous investigation to a section of the Philippine fault system, whether through paleoseismic trenching in Manila or post-earthquake field mapping in Cebu, the resulting picture reveals a hazard more extensive, more segmented, and more dangerous than the country's earlier, coarser hazard assessments had captured. In the interest of the same grounded, calibrated approach we try to bring to every story on this channel, it's worth being precise about what the Bogo Bay Fault's discovery does and does not mean for people living across the Philippines. It does not mean the Philippine fault system has suddenly become more dangerous than it was before September 2025. The fault itself, and whatever stress had been accumulating along it, existed in exactly the same physical state the day before the earthquake as it did the day after. What changed wasn't the underlying geology. It was scientists' knowledge of that geology, a critical and, in this case, genuinely life-saving distinction. The earthquake didn't create new danger. It revealed danger that had already existed silently for as long as this stretch of fault had been accumulating tectonic stress. What this discovery does confirm, with the kind of direct physical evidence earthquake science rarely gets handed this cleanly, is that Fivolt's long-standing publicly stated concern that undiscovered, unmapped fault segments exist within the broader Philippine fault system and are capable of producing genuinely damaging earthquakes was not overly cautious institutional hedging. It was an accurate assessment of the actual state of scientific knowledge, when the ground itself went on to confirm in the most direct, undeniable way possible, by rupturing exactly where nobody had been watching. There's a second related failure worth examining directly, because it reveals that the surprise in Cebu wasn't limited to the fault line itself. It extended to the secondary hazards that fault produced, hazards that ended up being just as deadly as the shaking. A significant share of the earthquake's death toll wasn't caused by collapsing buildings from the ground shaking alone. It came from landslides triggered by the quake, unleashed on slopes that, like the Bogo Bay Fault itself, hadn't been specifically flagged as high risk for this exact kind of earthquake-triggered failure. This pattern, a shallow, previously unmapped earthquake source, triggering a cascade of secondary hazards that compound the initial damage, is one seismologists specifically watch for in tectonically young mountainous terrain like much of the Philippines, where steep slopes, tropical rainfall-saturated soil, and active faulting combine to create conditions where an earthquake's danger doesn't stop at the edge of its direct shaking radius. This compounding effect is part of why the Bogo Bay Fault discovery carries implications well beyond simply adding one more line to a hazard map. It's a reminder that assessing the risk of an unmapped fault segment isn't just about estimating how strong a future earthquake along it might be. It's about understanding the full cascade of consequences that shallow rupture could trigger across the specific terrain surrounding it: landslides, liquefaction in low-lying coastal areas, and localized tsunami risk in any segment that extends offshore, each of which requires its own separate layer of hazard assessment that simply couldn't begin until scientists first confirmed the fault itself existed. It's worth placing the Bogo Bay Fault's sudden discovery within a broader, global pattern, because the Philippines is far from the only country where a damaging earthquake has revealed a fault science didn't previously know was there. Similar after-the-fact fault discoveries have occurred following major earthquakes elsewhere along the Pacific Ring of Fire and beyond, including previously unrecognized fault segments identified only after they ruptured in Japan, New Zealand, and parts of the western United States. What makes this pattern particularly significant for a country like the Philippines is the sheer density of both population and unmapped tectonic complexity, packed into a relatively small geographic footprint. The Philippine archipelago sits at the convergence of multiple major tectonic plates and microplates simultaneously, a level of structural complexity that dramatically increases the odds that additional, currently unmapped fault segments exist somewhere within the broader system, compared to a geologically simpler region with a single, well-defined plate boundary. This is precisely why seismologists studying the Bogo Bay Fault's emergence treat it not as a uniquely Philippine problem, but as a clear, concrete illustration of a challenge facing earthquake science globally. Comprehensive fault mapping is an enormously resource-intensive, multi-decade undertaking, and in any tectonically active country without unlimited scientific funding, gaps in that mapping are effectively guaranteed to exist, right up until an earthquake forces one of them into the open. In the immediate term, PHIVOLCS continues incorporating the Bogo Bay Fault directly into the Philippines' national seismic hazard maps, work that includes reassessing surrounding structures across Cebu and the wider Visayas for any additional undocumented fault segments that may share similar characteristics, given that faults capable of producing magnitude 6.9 ruptures rarely exist in complete geological isolation from surrounding structures. The extended aftershock sequence that followed the main earthquake, more than 12,000 recorded events and counting, continues to provide researchers with an unusually detailed real-time dataset for understanding exactly how this newly identified fault behaves, information that will directly inform updated building codes and hazard zoning across the affected region. More broadly, this discovery has added direct physical urgency to PHIVOLCS's ongoing effort to comprehensively reassess seismic hazard along the entirety of the Philippine fault system and the country's 6 major offshore trenches, an effort Director Bacocol's June 2026 statement about a potential magnitude 8.2 earthquake reflects directly. Continued paleoseismic trenching, GPS deformation monitoring, and post-earthquake field investigations, like the one that identified the Bogo Bay Fault, remain the primary tools available for closing the specific, acknowledged gap in scientific knowledge that this earthquake exposed so directly. The broader pattern connecting this story to the wider reality of living across the Philippine archipelago is one worth sitting with. This is a country built directly atop one of the most tectonically complex, most consistently active regions on the entire planet, where the very geology responsible for the island's formation continues to reshape the ground beneath millions of people's homes in ways science is still actively working to fully map. What happened in Bogo wasn't an unprecedented geological surprise dropped from nowhere. It was the confirmation of a warning scientists had been making for years, delivered in the only language a fault line ultimately speaks, not through a forecast or probability estimate, but through the ground itself, finally, violently, showing exactly where it had been hiding all along. If this kind of deep dive into the real science behind breaking geological events is what you come here for, subscribe now, because we cover stories exactly like this every single week. Drop a comment below and tell me if you have any connection to Cebu or the wider Philippines, and whether this is the first time you've heard about the Bogo Bay Fault. And if you know someone living anywhere along the Philippine fault system, send this to them, because understanding what the ground beneath a community has already revealed, and what it might still be hiding, is exactly the kind of knowledge that shapes how seriously a family takes their own earthquake preparedness. Thanks for watching.